It started with a single drunken kiss. The kind of stupid decision you make when you're drunk that makes you want to swear off alcohol for the rest of your life. Or 3 months in my case. But that's besides the point. The annual office party was something we all looked forward to. It was a chance for us to finally unwind with each other, be able to enjoy each other's company as more than just coworkers. And yes, I know it's not always a great idea to get super close to your coworkers. I knew that even back then. I'd also know never to kiss your coworkers, which is just a testament to how drunk I got that night. Martin was a friendly guy, well liked even though he had been only working there for a few months at that point. He was charismatic, good looking. We sat beside each other every day, and he was the type to strike up a friendly conversation with me randomly. At that point, we hadn't been super close friends or anything, but I did have some admiration for him. Our relationship at that point had been distant but amicable. And then I got drunk. We got drunk. We got drunk and somehow in the late hours of the party, when everyone else was either getting ready to leave or slumped against some piece of furniture dozing, Martin and I had ended up by ourselves in the corner, striking up a conversation that had somehow, inexplicably, ended up with us locking lips against the wall. Perhaps I had been so repressed at that point that I had just jumped at the opportunity. Due to work, it had been a while since I'd gotten any action, romantic or otherwise. Plus, he'd been a damn good kisser too. I didn't think anyone had seen us. We pulled away from each other seconds later, laughing and giggling against each other's lips like silly children who'd just done something naughty. His breath had reeked of alcohol, and I was sure mine had too. Tons of fun. Eventually, we parted ways and went to do other things, and the night ended when our boss, Dennis, who had somehow managed to remain sober for the entire night, stepped into the room and announced that the party was over. Someone called me a cab, and one way or the other, I was home, comfortably asleep in bed. The following morning, I didn't remember much of the party, especially into the later hours, but I definitely remembered what had happened between Martin and me. I was somewhat embarrassed that I had lost control to the point of doing something like exchanging a drunken kiss at a party, but at the same time, it felt exciting. Like I was young and in college again, experimenting with guys for the first time. I wondered if it had been just as exciting for Martin as it had been for me. I wasn't so optimistic that I thought we would spark up a passionate romantic relationship or something, but I at least hoped that it would break some of the ice between us. The next time we saw each other at work, I tried bringing it up in private, but to my chagrin, Martin had just laughed nonchalantly. "Oh, that?" He chuckled. "Peter, we were drunk. I hardly think that counts as anything exciting." We stood by the water cooler, talking in low tones. I blinked, trying not to let my surprise and, well, embarrassment show on my face. He said it so casually, like he hadn't given it a single thought since that night. And maybe he hadn't. For someone as popular as him, I guess a kiss like that didn't mean much to him. And perhaps it was just my bruised pride, but Martin suddenly seemed a lot more arrogant in my eyes. "Ah, really?" I smiled tightly as I reached out and grabbed a cup, filling it with cool water. "I just thought it was funny is all, but I guess you don't see it that way." I mumbled, bringing the cup to my mouth as I turned and walked back to my seat. The conversation ended peacefully enough that day, but that would very quickly become a rare occurrence. A very rare occurrence. Our dislike for each other grew gradually. Admittedly, it had been my fault, just a little bit. I couldn't quite help the fact that I was offended, and showed that by getting just a bit colder towards Martin. Martin, in turn, noticed this and quickly became irritated with me, returning my coldness with a chilly attitude of his own. And when we couldn't keep up the frostiness anymore, we began to bicker. "Peter, will you please check your inbox?" "What? Why?" "I sent you something over an hour ago, and it hasn't even been opened. I don't know what you're always doing on that computer, but it certainly doesn't seem to be anything work-related." "You've got lips and a tongue, haven't you?" A simple, "Hey, I just sent something over," would suffice instead of just plopping it into my inbox and assuming that I would telepathically be able to tell that Martin sent me something. I knew I sounded hysterical, but I had enough. If I wasn't a civilized man, I would have thrown him out of the window. Exchanges like this were common, and they were usually noticed by our coworkers. They started out being baffled and kind of amused by our spats, but I imagine they must have gotten tired at some point. I tried to ignore him as much as I could, but it was difficult when we sat so close to each other. We were constantly nipping at each other in ways that were simultaneously exhausting and, well, a little exciting. I didn't know it at the time, but bickering with him became something I had this weird anticipation for. I'd be getting ready in the morning and remember that I was going to see him, and I would groan and roll my eyes. But I secretly looked forward to it. It was strange, and I imagine it must have been the same for him. Neither of us noticed, of course, but other people certainly did. A few months later. Months passed. The company came into more money than had been imagined, and it was decided that something else would be done to celebrate instead of the usual party they threw. A lot of people were disappointed at first to learn that we wouldn't be having a party. I was quite relieved, for obvious reasons. We were all equally delighted to know what we would be doing though, which was taking a company trip. There weren't many of us working there after all, so the price would hardly be outrageous. Not to mention, not all of us would be able to go. Some of my coworkers were married with children. They could hardly afford to suddenly leave on a 2-week trip. I was not married with children. Seeing as I was in my early 30s at that point, I mourned that fact sometimes, but certainly not that day. A paid 2 weeks vacation at a nice hotel? Who wouldn't jump at that kind of opportunity? I spent the days after the announcements at the office preparing for the trip. I was so excited that I had failed to consider the one thing that would, without a doubt, completely ruin the experience for me. It slapped me right in the face just a few days to the trip. On the company group chat, we were sent the room assignments for the duration of the trip. I smiled as I opened the message and scanned the list to see who my name had been paired with. My smile vanished as soon as I saw it typed neatly beside Martin's name. My smile fell. The good mood I'd managed to maintain for days dissipated in an instant. No, I thought. Absolutely not. I was just barely managing to tolerate seating close to him at work. That was one thing. I knew that I would clock out eventually and head home, not having to see or hear anything about Martin for the next couple of hours, or days if it was the weekend. That was all well and good, but sharing a room with him? For 2 weeks? Sleeping in the same room, waking up, sharing a bedroom? It was going to drive me crazy. I was already going crazy just thinking about it. My instinct was to call up my boss and ask if the arrangements could be adjusted, but I hesitated. Wouldn't that be a little childish? My feud with Martin was already a little immature. I was willing to admit that to myself. So I actually felt a bit of shame at the idea of calling just to request a change of our sleeping arrangements. It made me feel embarrassed, so much so that I decided against it. It would drive me crazy, sure, but just how bad could it be? I was sure I would be able to handle it. A few days later. We all poured into the buses that had been brought over for us. Part of me had hoped Martin wouldn't show up for the trip at all, but to my dismay, he was there that morning. Of course he was. He was just like me, a bachelor without anything better to do. Our eyes met briefly, but he looked away almost immediately. Fine by me, I thought. The less we managed to acknowledge each other during the trip, the better. I wanted to actually enjoy myself after all. The trip was long, but I slept through most of it. When I woke up, the bus was just pulling into the parking lot of the hotel. I sat up, dazed but excited. The hotel was beautiful, and I knew the rest of the town was as well, seeing as I had done my research prior to that day. I was determined to enjoy myself, and I wasn't going to let anything stop me from doing that. We all trailed into the lobby with our luggage in tow. Dennis, who was the one organizing the trip, called out to all of us and instructed us to stay by our roommates while he sorted out getting our keys from the front desk. Reluctantly, I located Martin and went to stand beside him, dragging my suitcase along with me. He glanced at me. "I hope sharing a room with you is more enjoyable than sitting beside you," he said quietly, in a tone that made it sound like he did not believe that it was at all. I scoffed, crossing my arms over my chest. I've shared a room a few times and I've never had any complaints. Just make sure not to get in my space, I retorted. Beside us, I heard someone sigh. We both turned to see it was Millie. She sat near both Martin and I at work, so she had bore witness to a lot of our arguments over the months. "Come on, guys, here too?" She shook her head with a laugh. "I can't believe you ended up in a room together." Neither can I thought. try not to rip yourselves apart, please? She pressed her hands up against each other playfully, as if she was seriously begging us. It's for 2 weeks, so you guys have got to learn how to tolerate each other for now. Relax, we're not kids, Martin said, giving Millie that easy smile of his. We'll be good as gold, or, well, as long as Peter here will allow. I turned my head to him glaring. What's that supposed to mean? It means you're always the one picking a fight, he said bluntly. If you don't do that, then we'll be fine. Irritated, I clicked my tongue and looked away from him. I wanted to promise Millie that we wouldn't argue too much, but I couldn't be sure with this guy. Millie sighed again and brought her palm up to her forehead in exasperation. Dennis returned with our keys. He handed them out to each pair and ended up giving our key to Martin. It was, in all likelihood, probably because Martin was the one standing the closest to him, but it irked me just a bit regardless. Our 2 weeks here start officially tomorrow, so I advise everyone should rest up for now. Dennis said, It was a long trip, and I'm sure you'd all like to sleep in a nice, comfortable bed. Everyone mumbled their agreements, myself included. Sure, I had just woken up, but that bus seat had hardly been comfortable and my neck was killing me. The idea of snuggling up in a proper bed sounded very appealing to me in that moment. We headed to the elevators and gradually dispersed as everyone got off their respective floors. Soon, it was just Martin and me. Silently, I glanced at him as the elevator continued to rise, taking us to the 9th floor. Part of me wondered if this arrangement had just been a coincidence. There was no way it could have been. It was clear to everyone that Martin and I disliked each other. Was this someone's attempt at trying to get us to settle our differences? As if sensing my stare, he looked over at me and raised a brow as if asking, "What are you looking at?" Slightly embarrassed, I turned my head away again. Even if it was a deliberate push for us to get along, I didn't see it happening. Martin seemed too full of himself for that to happen. At least, that's what I told myself. In truth, my pride was still bruised and I have a habit of being stubborn. Just a bit. The elevator doors opened and we walked down to our room. Our first night in that room together can be summed up in 2 words. Awkward and infuriating. The room, while nice, was not too big. It wasn't small either, but it was not big enough for either of us to effectively ignore the other's presence. As we moved around the room and tried to settle down, we kept running into each other. At the table, at the closet, on the way to the bathroom. For the time being, we tried to maintain the peace. We tried to follow Millie's advice and not eat each other alive. And we managed to do this for like 20 minutes. But eventually, he got into the bathroom to take a shower and ended up staying there for just a bit too long. I sat in my bed, waiting for him and bouncing my knee impatiently, before I stood and went to knock on the door. "Could you hurry it up, please?" I called out, trying to keep my voice as civil as possible. "I'd like to take a shower too, preferably sometime tonight." "Relax, I'll be out soon," he responded, and all I could do was huff and go back to my bed. He stepped out soon enough, now wearing more comfortable clothes. I sighed and stood up. "Took you long enough," I complained as I walked past him. "Sorry to have kept you waiting, Your Honor," he responded drily, still drying his hair with a towel. I scoffed and stepped into the bathroom, shutting the door behind me. The bathroom was still warm and smelled very strongly of the same soap I had smelled on him a couple of times. Not that the way he smelled was something I paid close attention to. I leaned against the door and sighed. I couldn't believe I'd have to deal with this for 14 days. So much for a peaceful vacation. I had no idea just how much more complicated it was about to get. The next few days. Our trip began in earnest the next day. Martin and I woke up and got ready, stepping on each other's toes the entire time. Still, we emerged from our room and went to meet up with the others in the lobby. We went sightseeing that day as a group. Later, we would get the opportunity to explore the town individually, but it was certainly fun as a group. I managed to stay out of Martin's way for the entire time we were outside, and Martin stayed out of mine. As the sun set, we headed back to the hotel, laughing after a day of fun. All my stress had been sucked right out of my body for a few perfect golden hours, and it returned as soon as Martin and I were alone in our room again. I sighed to myself as I laid on my bed, scrolling on my phone. I was looking forward to the next morning. As we walked, Millie had come up to me and pointed out a sauna the locals frequented. I read reviews online. Apparently it's like super relaxing. She shot a sideways glance at Martin. If he's really giving you that much trouble, it might be a good idea for you to unwind there for a bit. I thought about that and decided that, yeah, she has a point. The next morning, I was up at the crack of dawn. I moved quietly, not wanting to wake Martin, who I had assumed was still sleeping. Perhaps I should have paid closer attention to his bed, but the room had been dark, and I had still been tired. I left the hotel and began the short walk to the sauna. The morning air was fresh and crisp and cool. I reached the sauna, paid for an hour inside, and changed into a towel. The person at the front desk told me I had come at a good time. There was only one other person in the room. I would have preferred it if there was no one else there, but how bad could it be with a single other person? I entered the room with a pep in my step, eager to just enjoy the feeling of the warm steam on my skin. And I walked in on none other than Martin sitting on one of the benches, his head tipped back against the wall and a towel covering his eyes. I froze in place like deer caught in headlights, cursing my luck. I waited for him to realize that he wasn't alone, but he didn't move. And that was when I realized that he was fast asleep. His lips were slightly parted, his bare chest rising and falling in time with his deep breaths. I probably should have just left right at that moment, but I found myself lingering. Every so often, I would find myself wondering just why exactly Martin seemed to be so popular, especially with women. And often, I would get a very poignant reminder of that reason. This was one of those reasons. To my complete shock, I couldn't help but stare at the way the skin of his torso flushed. It was coated in a thin layer of sweat. I watched silently as a drop, water, or it might have been sweat, rolled down from his collarbone, down the swell of his chest, down his sculpted abdomen, and disappeared past his towel. Peter? I jumped, my gaze snapping back up to his face. He had woken up and was peeking at me from a small gap in under his towel. My face turned horribly red. I hoped he would just think I was flushing from the steam. He sat up properly, taking the towel off his face and watching me with a slightly puzzled expression. What are you... I guess we had the same idea, I said quickly. How long had he watched me stare at him? I wanted to disappear into the steam and become invisible. I thought I'd check this place out, but since you're already here, I turned stiffly to go. You don't have to go. Multiple people can stay in one sauna. Or did you not know that? I heard him say. I didn't need to look at him to know he was smiling. I could hear it in his voice. He had caught me staring at his body. I wanted to claw at my hair. I could have just left, but now it felt like if I did that, I would be admitting defeat. Defeat to what? I didn't know. But it definitely felt like Martin was issuing some kind of silent challenge to me. Do you have the balls to sit in here with me even after that? That sort of feeling. My face was still burning, but I turned around to face him. He was indeed smiling. His elbow was propped up to his knee, and his chin was resting against his palm. You're right, I responded, smiling stiffly back at him. I walked into the room and sat on the bench across from him. I had hoped the steam would warm me up on that chilly morning, but at that point I felt thoroughly warm all over without it. I guess I'll relax for a little while, I said. A few hours later. I didn't last 30 minutes in there with him. I couldn't. I was sure that if I stayed any longer, I would either die from embarrassment or strangle him. When Martin found a sore spot he could abuse when it came to me, he never, ever let it go. And that day, I had managed to let a terrible weakness slip. The fact that I still found him attractive even after our months of bickering. He'd sighed dramatically and put his towel back on his face, leaning back as if putting himself on full display for me. When he did move, it was to make the room even hotter, which worked up more of a sweat than I would have liked. He saw the irritated expression on my face and gave me a look of fake concern. What's up, Peter? He asked me, cocking his head. Too hot for you? I scowled, unable to take his teasing any longer. I stood up. Yes, actually, I'm heading back. I huffed. I stormed to the door, but not fast enough for me to not hear him quietly chuckling under his breath as I did. I showered and went back to the hotel, grumbling under my breath the entire time. I was done for. He was never going to let me live this down. I was frustrated, both with him and myself. There was no way I still actually felt something for him. Was there? We had just shared a kiss. It had excited me, but he seemed to not be impressed by it. And that was that. Now we disliked each other. That was how things had turned out. But if that was the case, I wondered why. Why was I still red-faced? He was an attractive guy, sure, but surely that alone didn't warrant any kind of reaction. A few days later, Martin was smug. From that day at the sauna, anytime I tried to snap at him in my usual way, it always felt like it fell flat. It drove me crazy how helpless I felt. Our relationship felt more childish than ever in those days. In our hotel room, he started casually strolling around shirtless, as if inviting me to look as much as I wanted. I wanted to smack him. One day, I couldn't take it anymore. "Can you please put on a shirt?" I snapped as he got up to turn the television on. He paused and turned back to me, and I immediately regretted saying anything at all. "Why? Is it bothering you?" he asked me. The oblivious attitude made me clench my jaw. "You know exactly why," I hissed, my ears burning. "You're acting like a peacock. It's childish." He turned to face me fully then, crossing his arms over his chest. "I'm childish? That's rich." He laughed. "Do you even know how you act?" I stood up, now simmering with anger. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you act like a little boy, obviously. You always do. You're doing it right now." Annoyed, I stormed over to stand in front of him. We were about the same height, but I had a smaller frame. "I don't act like a little boy," I argued, even though I knew fully well that I had the tendency to be childish. "You absolutely do. You have since that night," he snapped back. I recoiled slightly. It was the first time either of us would bring up what had happened that night. "Well," I spluttered out, flustered and caught a bit off guard. "Well, I'm sorry for being offended at you just pushing me to the side after that." When I said it out loud, it sounded more like a confession than I would have liked. Martin scoffed. "What? So that's why you got so prickly every time I tried to talk to you after that?" he asked. "You immediately tried butting up with me again like nothing happened. Like you just wanted to completely ignore what had happened that night. Like it was such an embarrassing thing for you that you wanted to erase it from existence completely." I threw my hands up in frustration. Of course I would get prickly. "Well, maybe I just regretted what I said that day, okay?" He spat suddenly. "Maybe I was trying to make up for it, but you never gave me the chance. You just went right to acting like a spoiled kid." "I am not..." I was about to complain at him, comparing me to a child again, when I paused, playing back his words in my head. "You regretted it," I repeated, narrowing my eyes suspiciously. Martin blinked at me, as if he just realized what he had just said. "I mean, I guess it might have been harsh for me to just brush you off like that," he said after a moment. His words sounded significantly less confident than they had just the previous moment. "I wanted to apologize." I frowned at him in confusion. "So why didn't you?" "I just said you didn't give me a chance to," he huffed. "You just went straight to being angry with me." "That's only because I thought you were trying to..." My voice rose in volume again as I started to defend myself, but I paused and sighed, deciding it wasn't worth it. I raised a hand to my forehead and rubbed it, exasperated. "In any case, just put on a shirt," I grumbled. "I still don't know what this has to do with you." He was still feigning ignorance. "I just want to be shirtless." "Oh, give me a break, Martin," I groaned, rolling my eyes. "Is this fun for you?" "Watching you try to deny that you're not still attracted to me?" He smiled then. "Yeah, I'm having a blast." "What makes you think..." I started to deny it, but the way he raised his eyebrow made me realize that it would be completely pointless. "You're infuriating. Why are you like this with only me?" I asked him. "I could ask you the same question." To my surprise, he suddenly took a step forward. "You never try to argue with anyone else like this, even when they make you angry." We stared at each other for a moment, He didn't say anything more, but his meaning was clear as day. We both knew the reason. Maybe we had known on some subconscious level for a while, but now there was absolutely no denying it, even with all the apparent miscommunication that had been going on. The question was, which one of us was willing to put our pride aside and actually address the issue at hand? Finally, after the moment, I shifted where I was standing. When you said, we started speaking at the exact same time. We both paused. He nodded to me, signaling that it was okay for me to keep going. Well, I continued. When you said you regretted what you said that day, did you just mean you regretted how blunt you have been? Or did you have any second thoughts? Martin bit the inside of his cheek. Well, I thought back and realized that it had been fun, he confessed. And then, in a lower voice, he added, but it's been so long that I barely remember it. For a moment, I felt like all the blood in my body had rushed right back to my head. Well, I breathed after a second. We can always try to jog our memories. The words were hardly out of my mouth when Martin took one more step forward, completely closing the space between us and pressing his lips against mine like a man starved. I relaxed and my eyes shut. Jeez, I thought to myself as I held onto his shoulders. All that just to get this? We're complete idiots. Sometime later. Our trip drew to an end after 2 weeks. Our coworkers were surprised to see that Martin and I were on significantly better terms than we had been when we left for the trip. Glad to see you guys are getting along now, Dennis had told us when we showed up to the office the week after the trip ended. Forcing you guys into that room had been a good idea. I thought back to some of the things that had gone down in that room during the trip's final days. Getting along is a gross statement, I said mentally, but I didn't say that out loud. A couple weeks later, Martin and I were hanging out in his apartment. Lounging on his bed, we both laughed at our silliness. I guess we really did need to be stuck with each other to clear the air, Martin said. Dennis made the right call there. Yeah, the sauna thing was a crazy coincidence though, I said, my head resting on his chest. It must have been fate that moved Millie to tell me about it that day, Martin said. Shocked, I sat up to look at his face. She told you about it? I asked, blinking. She told you too? He watched me, his eyes wide. And then we both burst into an uncontrollable fit of laughter. Conclusion. Well, what do I have to say to defend myself now? Soon after that particular kiss in the hotel room, many others followed. And it didn't just stop at the kisses. As much as I appreciated Dennis and Millie's help, I couldn't deny that Martin and I had done the most part. And we had. If we hadn't infuriated each other like that, maybe we wouldn't have fallen into each other's arms just like that. The end. Have you ever had any big problems caused by small miscommunication? Thanks for watching. And hey, if you enjoyed our stories, consider supporting us on Ko-Fi and join our Rainbow Force to help us bring more LGBTQ+ stories to life and to stay wholesome.